The funeral was already underway when the elderly man arrived. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, with a cane tapping softly on the concrete path leading toward the burial site. Rows of polished black dress shoes and pressed uniforms stood in rigid silence. Buglers stood at attention. A folded flag rested atop a gleaming casket. No one noticed him at first. He wore a faded brown coat, a wool cap pulled low, and his slacks were frayed at the hems. His eyes scanned the crowd, quietly searching. A couple of young officers near the entrance gave him a sideways glance and exchanged a few murmured words. One of them stepped forward. "Sir, this section is for family and invited guests only." The old man nodded gently. "I understand." He didn't argue. He simply moved off to the side, standing alone under a small patch of shade near the outer fence. The sunlight glinted off the silver on his cane handle, a symbol few noticed or recognized. From where he stood, he could barely hear the chaplain's voice. Still, he stayed. But someone else noticed him. Someone in full dress uniform, chest adorned with rows of ribbons and stars on his shoulder, a 4-star general standing near the front, facing the casket. And in that moment, everything began to change. The general's eyes had been fixed on the flag-draped coffin. Until now. His gaze broke away, not toward the chaplain, nor the honor guard, but toward the fence. Toward the man in the brown coat. Something in the general's expression shifted. A recognition. A memory. He leaned toward his aide and whispered, "Who is that man, by the fence?" The aide blinked. I don't know, sir. He wasn't on the list." The general didn't respond. Instead, he stepped away from the line of officials, his polished shoes crunching lightly on the gravel path. The movement caught the attention of everyone nearby, officers, enlisted, family, all now watching the one man no one expected to move. The chaplain paused mid-sentence. The honor guard stiffened in confusion. The air became still. Every eye followed the general as he walked past the rows of mourners. Past the front pew. Past the wreaths. Straight toward the old man standing quietly under the tree. The elderly man looked up, a little surprised but calm. His hand instinctively reached for the brim of his cap. The general stopped in front of him, snapped his heels together, and saluted, sharp and full. "Sir," the general said, voice clear and respectful. "I apologize. This service cannot continue without you present." A collective breath caught in the crowd. The old man blinked slowly, his hand frozen midway to his cap. "I didn't mean to cause a disruption," he said quietly. The general lowered his salute, but his tone remained unwavering. "You didn't. We did. That's on us." The young officers who had previously turned the man away were now standing rigid, faces pale with realization. They hadn't known. Most of the crowd hadn't. But the general knew exactly who this man was. "Escort him," the general ordered, nodding toward his aide. "No need," the old man said, adjusting his cane. "I can walk." And so, in complete silence, the general walked beside him, step for step, back toward the heart of the funeral. Every head turned. The chaplain stood frozen. Mourners rose to their feet. Even the flag bearers subtly adjusted their stance. As the old man approached the front row, a soldier quietly offered his own seat. The general placed a steadying hand on the elderly man's back, helping him ease down. Then, for the first time that day, the general turned to face the crowd. He spoke loudly and without notes. "This man is not a guest. He's a legend." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the rows. And then the general said the name. The name that had been left off the program. The name that made several officers lower their heads in shame. "Master Sergeant Harold Gaines," the general announced, his voice echoing across the silent field. "Decorated in 3 wars. Led men through missions most of us only read about. Carried wounded on his back for miles, twice. And the man who personally saved the one in that casket. The crowd fell still. All eyes turned to Harold. Some blinked in disbelief. Others looked down, guilt washing over their formal faces. Even the chaplain's hands trembled slightly, his Bible lowered to his chest. The general turned toward the casket and nodded. The man we're honoring today wouldn't be here without him. Literally. A beat passed. He was too modest to tell us he was coming, the general continued. Too respectful to interrupt. And too strong to need anyone to speak for him. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One officer who had earlier dismissed Harold wiped sweat from his brow. Harold didn't say a word. His eyes were locked on the casket, his jaw set firm, not in pride, but in memory. The general then looked to the chaplain and gave a single nod. Now, he said, we may continue. The chaplain cleared his throat and began again, voice steadier than before. But from that moment on, every word, every note, every salute, all of it, carried the weight of the man who had nearly been forgotten. Next part. Part 5 ChatGPT, Part 5, a funeral rewritten. The service continued, but it wasn't the same. What had started as a rigid, formal military funeral had now taken on something far deeper, reverence, not just for the man in the casket, but for the man who'd nearly been left outside its reach. The honor guard moved with sharper precision. The rifles fired their salute with thunderous pride. When the bugler played taps, more than a few in uniform had tears in their eyes. Harold sat still, hands folded over his cane. His face didn't reveal much, not grief, not pride, just quiet reflection. But those around him stole glances, no longer ignoring him. Now, they leaned in, trying to understand who he truly was. After the final prayer, the folded flag was carried forward. The general took it with great care, then turned, not to the family, not to the officials, but to Harold. He held it out. I know this usually goes to the next of kin, the general said. But sir, without you, there'd be nothing to pass on. Harold looked at the flag, stunned. I can't accept that. I'm not family. The general's tone was steady. You were his last commander. And his friend. For a long moment, Harold just stared at it. Then he reached out, took the flag with both hands, and held it to his chest like it weighed 1,000 memories. The crowd remained silent, no applause, no movement, only respect. Next part. Part 6 ChatGPT, Part 6, the walk that meant everything. As the ceremony ended, the crowd began to rise, slowly and thoughtfully. No one rushed to leave. A few officers quietly approached Harold, offering hands they hadn't extended earlier. Some simply nodded with newfound respect. Even the chaplain stopped to bow his head to him, not as a gesture of rank, but of deep reverence. But Harold didn't linger. With the folded flag still in his arms, he stood carefully, using his cane to steady himself. The general moved beside him again, but this time, Harold nodded for him to stay. I've walked out of worse places alone, he said with a faint grin. The general didn't argue. He stood at attention and offered one final salute as Harold began walking back toward the gates, the same gates where he'd been turned away just an hour earlier. But this time, the entire funeral party turned to watch him go. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stood in still silence, as the sun dipped lower behind the trees and the old man with the cane carried the flag of a friend, and a legacy, into the fading light. At the gate, one of the junior officers who'd spoken sharply to him earlier stood waiting, hat in hand. He didn't say much, just looked at the ground and muttered, "I'm sorry, sir." Harold paused, glanced at him, and gently said, "You will learn. Just don't forget." Then he walked out, leaving behind a funeral, and a room full of men and women forever changed by a quiet moment of recognition. Final part coming next. Part 7 ChatGPT, Part 7, a legacy. Remembered later that evening, the reception hall was quieter than expected. People still gathered, sharing stories and food, but there was a shift in the air, a weight of humility that hadn't been there before. Officers who normally held court at tables were now listening more than speaking. One young cadet approached the general and asked, "Sir, was that really the Harold Gaines?" The general nodded slowly. He never asked for medals. Never asked for speeches. He just showed up when it counted. "And today?" the cadet asked. The general glanced toward the window, where the last glow of sunset painted the sky in gold and fire. "Today," he said, he reminded all of us what honor really looks like. Quiet. Steady. Unshakable. That night, Harold returned to his small home, placed the folded flag on a shelf above a worn photo of his old unit, and sat in his armchair, tired but at peace. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. He didn't need to. Because by morning, the story had already spread. Not from press. Not from social media. But from every soldier, officer, and guest who'd been there and witnessed it, the day a four-star general stopped everything, not for ceremony, not for protocol, but for a man whose presence demanded none of it, yet deserved it all. The end. Would you like a video description, tags, and disclaimer next? Part 8 ChatGPT, Part 8 Echoes in the ranks. The following week, something unexpected happened. Across multiple bases and academies, instructors began referencing the Gaines funeral. They didn't focus on the man in the casket. They talked about the man who stood quietly by the fence, and the general who stopped everything for him. A copy of the funeral program, now updated with Master Sergeant Harold Gaines's name, began circulating in leadership courses. At one military college, a chalkboard read, "Leadership isn't about rank. It's about who you stop everything for." Younger officers began asking questions. Why didn't anyone recognize him at first? Why wasn't his name already listed? What would have happened if the general hadn't seen him? Those questions hung in the air, uncomfortable, necessary. Meanwhile, Harold never spoke publicly about the event. He didn't give interviews. He didn't appear on the news. But one day, months later, a small bronze plaque appeared near the cemetery gates where he'd been turned away. No press. No unveiling. Just a single inscription, "He stood quietly, until honor remembered him." And beneath it, a final line in smaller type, "Master Sergeant Harold Gaines, 3 wars. 1 legacy." Next final part, Part 9. Part 9 ChatGPT, Part 9, The Final Salute. Years passed. The story of Harold Gaines became a quiet cornerstone in officer briefings, a tale passed between veterans and whispered among cadets during night watches. It wasn't just about one man, it was about what the military nearly forgot, and what it chose, at the last second, to remember. When Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep, the Department of Defense received the notice through a local veterans clinic. At first, it looked like it might be another quiet passing, just like so many others. But someone remembered. The same 4-star general, now retired, made one phone call. Then another. Word spread fast. Faster than Harold would have liked. At his funeral, there were no empty seats. Soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors filled the cemetery. The honor guard was handpicked. No one had to be told who he was. They knew. This time, his name was on every program. His medals were displayed at the front. And when the flag was folded, it was handed not to a next of kin, but placed on the same shelf at the base museum, beneath the inscription, "Some men command armies. Others command silence." The general gave the final words. He never raised his voice. Never chased the spotlight. But he changed the way we see service, forever. And then, in the kind of hush that can only fall among warriors, hundreds stood at attention as the bugler played. No one dared to move. Because they all knew. This wasn't just a farewell to a soldier. It was the final salute, to a standard. Would you like the video description, tags, and disclaimer now? Part 10 ChatGPT, Part 10, after the silence long after the last salute echoed and the crowd had gone, a single cadet remained at Harold's grave. She was young, barely 20, and wore the crisp uniform of someone just beginning her service. She stood there alone for a while, cap in hand, staring at the headstone. Then she pulled a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket and tucked it gently beneath the bouquet resting against the stone. It wasn't a letter of goodbye. It was a promise. Later that night, she posted a single sentence in a private military forum: "I don't want to be the kind of leader who has to be reminded." That post went viral inside military circles. The next month, a guest lecture titled "The Harold Gaines Standard" was added to the officer development curriculum at 3 academies. Not required. But always full. And every year, on the anniversary of that day, the day the funeral paused for one forgotten man, a small group of soldiers, retired and active, returned to that spot under the trees. No speeches. No fanfare. Just a folded flag laid gently at the foot of the plaque, and a minute of absolute silence. Not because they had to. But because some men, like Master Sergeant Harold Gaines, serve once in war, and forever in memory. The end. Would you like the video description, tags, and disclaimer now? Part 11 ChatGPT, Part 11, the letter found later nearly a year after Harold Gaines was laid to rest. A wooden box was discovered in a closet of his modest home. Inside were old photos, medals, and neatly folded letters, some yellowed with age, others more recent. But at the very top was a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only after I'm gone." The envelope made its way to the retired general, the one who had stopped the funeral for Harold all those years ago. He opened it slowly, expecting a personal note or perhaps instructions for a final wish. Instead, it read, "To whomever reads this, if this letter has reached you, then I'm no longer around to cause a fuss about being recognized. Good. I never served for applause. I didn't march for ceremonies. I didn't carry my brothers through fire to be remembered, I did it so they'd live to remember others. But if, somehow, someone paused the world long enough to ask who I was, thank you. Not for honoring me, but for reminding the next generation what it means to notice the quiet ones. If you truly want to honor my memory, don't give a speech. Don't name a building. Just don't walk past someone like me again. And if you wear the uniform, wear it like you'd hand it back to the ones who didn't make it home. That's all. H.G." The general folded the letter with care. He didn't speak for a while. Then he stood, put on his old dress coat, and pinned a small silver emblem on the inside of the collar, the same kind Harold had worn on his cane. He didn't tell anyone what the letter said. He didn't need to. Because the message was already working, in silence. Years later, long after the funeral and long after those who remembered Harold personally had retired or passed on, something surprising happened. A young recruit, barely through basic training, stood at the back of a military museum during orientation. Her eyes stopped on a quiet display, a cane with a silver emblem, a folded flag, and a bronze plaque beneath a photo of an elderly man in a simple coat. She didn't recognize the name at first. But the inscription beneath it read, "Master Sergeant Harold Gaines." He didn't raise his voice. The world paused anyway. She asked her instructor, who was he? The instructor didn't give a long biography. He simply said, he was the reminder we all needed, that honor isn't loud. Sometimes it just waits at the gate, hoping someone sees it. And from that moment, the story lived again, passed from class to class, whispered during late watches, recited in essays, retold in small tributes that never reached the headlines. There were no monuments for Harold in Washington. But there was something stronger. A new habit. Across bases, soldiers began quietly watching for those standing alone. Recruits were trained not just to follow orders, but to look deeper. And when someone quiet entered a room, eyes lifted, not out of curiosity, but respect. Harold Gaines had never asked for attention. But he changed the way a military saw its own. Not with noise. With presence.